One of the key things, though, in connecting with people is they need to know who you are.
Do you believe that a man can fly? Was it a dream or was it third outside? Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fly. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fly. The future's not what it used to be. 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 I try to sleep, but my mind won't stop. In the machine, I am a broken part. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fly. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fly. The future's not what it used to be. 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 I'm on a road full of highwaymen. They try to steal what little time is left. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fight. Don't ever let them tell you that you can't fight. The future's not what it used to be. 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 In the clouds, you know we're never coming down. We keep our head up in the clouds. You know we're never coming down. We keep our head up in the clouds. You know we're never coming down. We keep our head up in the clouds. You know we're never coming down. We're running out of time. You know we're running out of time. Oh no, we're running out of time. You know we're running out of
Just kind of a, hey, how you doing? Good to meet you.
It's interesting. You knew from high school, from the moment you got your first electric guitar, that you were going to be you were going to be doing music as a part of your life. You just didn't know how, right? So talk about that evolution and discovering this passion that you found.
Well, I mean, it started with death metal. Honestly, that was the thing that my friends and I listened to in high school, and we were like, we just want to play music, and this was the music we knew. So we just started doing that, and of course, like people were just getting a kick out of it. A bunch of little high school kids out there sounding like like I don't know, a bunch of drunk bikers and everything. It was fun. And from there, when I got into college, I started meeting a bunch of people and got to get into producing. So I got, found some hip hop artists who were like, well, come hang out with us. We're writing music. We're doing this. We're getting shows together. So I learned about that, and which led into student films and short film scoring. So I started learning how to do like Foley art and kind of sound design, that sort of thing. And it was just the more I did it and the more I just kind of kept my ears open, everyone wanted to show me some kind of new music. Everyone wanted me like, oh, well, check this out, or here's my band, or here's one of my favorite artists. And it's like the more you start to hear, the more you kind of like your brain starts creating things out of that, and you kind of start to find your taste and your style and everything. Like Monster Magnet and Clutch were probably really big influences on my rock sound. But I mean, doing like trip hop and doing beats and doing classical music, it's just from the stuff that you hear, you start to come up with new ideas. And I think that kind of diversity is what really helps you grow as a musician.
You mentioned that you did film score and things like that too, and along this journey, you happened to make some short films. You were doing filmmaking. I've heard that I couldn't verify this, but that you ventured into pro wrestling at some point too. Is that right, or something to that effect? I'm not.
Yeah, for about I guess a little over a year now, going on a year and a half, I've been wrestling with a group called PWR,
Oh,
and
nice.
we do quarterly shows, and they're pretty big turnouts. Um, and yeah, I've always been a wrestling fan since I was a kid, and like the Attitude Era for WWF, which is now WWE and everything, and
Yeah.
I was a big fan, like the Hardy Boys and the Brood and Rock and Stone Cold, and definitely not something I expected to start doing in my 30s, but it's worked out. It's nice, like kind of going in and already having this years and years of knowledge behind it because you watch it so much. When
Right.
someone calls out a move, you're like, I know what that is. I don't know how to do it, but I know what it looks like.
From that standpoint, you did some filmmaking and things like that. If you had gone that path instead of the music, do you feel like you would have been okay with where you ended up, or do you feel like music was always going to call to you no matter what, and that somehow, some way, you were going to do some kind of music in that respect?
I think music is always going to be a part of my life, and the dynamics change.
Mhm.
Like when I was younger, it was about being on stage, being on tour, playing every place you possibly could, and that was like the rock star mentality. You're like, you got to have that, you got to do that, and then after doing that for like 10 years, I kind of started to shift more in the behind the scenes. Like I wanted to do something more production wise, and I got really interested in the science of music and frequency manipulation and what EQ could really do for a track, and kind of learning that, and then realizing that there were a lot of people who were, I guess, like, they're starting off now, or they've been doing it for a little bit, but they're where I was 10 years ago, and all the questions and everything they have coming up, it's kind of cool to be able to help them with it. And I feel like even though I do, the pro wrestling stuff now, and even though back in, what was it, like 2006, I think I started doing Ninja Warrior, and that was back when G4 still had Ninja Warrior on it before it became American Ninja Warrior and everything. And I was doing that, but I was always, for all like the trial videos, I would write a new track for it. I would do some kind of music for it. If anybody had something, they were like, oh, I'm working on this commercial or this YouTube video or something, can you write a quick song for it? I would always be kind of in that mode of writing some sort of music somewhere, and it usually supplemented the things I was doing. So like my entrance theme song is also the track Odyssey from the last album. So every time I come out, I'm coming out to my own music, my own rock, like I know the vibe already, and it's kind of cool.
You mentioned you worked with some hip hop artists, and you started doing some electronic and engineering and working with EQ and things like that. And I'm wondering, as a metal guy growing up and a rock guy growing up, this diversification of your portfolio, where you were able to have all this different types of music around you and be involved in it directly, do you think that made you a better musician, or do you think it changed you as a musician? How do you view that time and how it's affected you now?
It absolutely changes you as a musician, because I feel like sometimes whenever I hear people say, oh, I only do this genre, or I only like this genre, it bums me out a little bit, because there's a part of me that's like, but you don't realize how much you're missing that still applies to the genre you like. I mean, there's blues in rock and roll, there's blues in death metal. There's so much you can do with, I mean, drums are so universal. I mean, granted, there are some that as you hear them, you're like, oh, I can tell this is this style of music from the West. You can tell when it's Latin. You can tell when it's like a straight up like hip hop beat or something like that. But there are some that are so fluid, you can go between genres on it, which is, I think, what makes amazing cover songs too, is when you have a song that is specifically hard rock, and then a singer-songwriter covers it with an acoustic and like a tambourine, and people are like, oh, that's an amazing song. When'd you write that? And it's actually, like a Metallica cover or something. It makes you a better musician when you're aware of all the different styles and what they can do, because I think it kind of triggers your mind into something where you might be stuck in this pattern of this is the only way you play it. And then you hear something else and you're like, well, what if I try playing this way? And I think that's where your really innovative musicians come from. The people who make it and they go on for years and years and years. You know, unless you're like AC/DC or something, who their style never changed and they were always popular. It doesn't happen for most bands. Like you have to kind of evolve with the time. You got to evolve with the taste. And plus, evolution is not a bad thing. You know, people are like, "Oh, you're changing," or "Oh, you're selling out. You went for this because it was more popular." It's what you feel, and if you're able to write to what you feel, I don't I don't see any problem with that. Even like genre crossovers, you know, like it still sounds good. It sounds good.
I'm curious, do you see a diversification in your fan base too? Does your fan base grow because you are touching on other genres, or you're mixing around with other things and growing as an artist?
Definitely. There's the solid group of kind of like the people who knew me from the metal days that no matter whenever I play rock, they're always there for it. But you have some people who you know, they're polite about it, but they can't stand my rock music. Like they just like Strings of Atlas. No, it's way too heavy. It's this weird metal, and it's not metal. It's not, but it feels like it to people who don't listen to it on a regular basis. They're like, way too heavy, can't do it.
I can tell by the way that you're burning your days, that your time's already come and gone. Hear that sound in your voice, consequence in your choices. Are you settling for where you got stuck? Now tell me, how do you feel? Now tell me, how do you feel? Do it all for you, like they do it all for me. And we'll take a little time and see all that we can see, that's right.
But then you lay out something like Chords of Eve, which is all pop, trip hop, female fronted vocals and everything. And they're like, oh, this is kind of like, it's a little more palatable. It's easier to take in. It's not as rough on the ears, not like right in your face.
These are the days of tainted gold. These are the days of hot and cold. But there are things that I want you to know. Despite all that, you are beautiful. Look on the bright side.
And it becomes more acceptable. And all of a sudden, they, realizing what you do, respect you as a musician rather than I just like this band. And what's cool about that is it kind of gives you that open mind where you're like, well, I'm going to go and try something else, but when I come back, you'll be here, right? I'm like, yeah, because I want to hear more of this. So I think it gives you that opening in your relationships where people accept the fact that you just love music and that you love the creation, and that some of the stuff they'll like and some they won't. And it's like they're okay with that. And I'm okay with that. You know, like I don't get offended if people are like, oh, the rock and stuff is too heavy for me. It makes sense. Some people it is too heavy for. And other ones are like, oh, well, you're doing this weird ambient music. When's it ever pick up? When's it get heavy? I can't listen to it. And it's like, cool, I get it. It's not for everyone. But I think that the real, like the true loyal fans too are always excited to see that you're doing something else, even if it's not their taste. And they back you up on that 100%. They just love the fact that someone's out there creating and making something for them.
You know, you've been doing String of Atlas since 2006.
Long time.
and you mentioned how you remember those days being underground mostly and being, you know, very, very discoverable as a band. You know, those underground bands that they kind of get a niche, they get like a clique, a following, a small little gathering because it's my band. That's my band because I know the guys and everything like that, you know. And I'm curious, now that you're a little bit bigger, you're expanding your horizons a bit. Do you miss those days a little bit? Does it feel like I know that you probably could go back there and do something like that and relive that nostalgia, but do you feel like there's a nostalgic feeling to that and kind of and it doesn't make you feel like a real musician because you've had that experience?
It's definitely there. I mean, there are times where even I flash back to high school and just being that weird, unique group that does this screaming metal who, you know, a bunch of kids who can't really play that well, but we played with a lot of enthusiasm, you know? And people were just always so supportive about it. They would follow us from show to show to show. They'd be like, let me buy you pizza. And then as we got older, let me buy you a beer. You know? It just like, it kept going. And I think there is something said about that like kind of camaraderie, that feeling of the people who are listening to you are like, this is my band. Like, this is someone that I want to check out. I know their words. I know what they're trying to say to me. I know where they're coming from and things, and they want that relationship with you. But I don't necessarily think that you lose that as you start to get bigger. You lose it to a degree only because now instead of 40 people, you've got 4,000 people. Anytime you get a crowd going, it's hard to keep up with every single person individually.
Yeah.
But I feel like people understand that, and then as a group, they kind of start to get collective, and maybe where they can't interact with you and say, hey, I heard this song and this is what I thought about it, but they're there in the moment with you and with other like-minded people in that, and they connect with each other. They connect to whoever's close by, and they're like, hey, what do you think of this song? Did you feel this? And there's still that kind of community feeling, even if it's not as direct with you. And I think that's still a really important thing to have, because even as you grow, it does become more and more difficult. Like you can't answer every single comment that you get on like Facebook or on YouTube.
Yeah.
You can't reply to every email when you're getting 10,000. You know, it becomes like, it kind of, no matter how many people you have working with you responding to it, you can't personally get to all of this.
Yeah.
And you never want someone to feel like you're that big rock star now. You're untouchable. You don't care. You're like unrelatable, you know, you're like private jets and things everywhere, and no one can talk to you anymore. You never want that feeling, because or at least I feel like it disconnects you from the music itself. Like the music's what makes you vibe with people. And if you don't have that connection with people, then your music's kind of just there.
What do you like about where you're at now as opposed to when you started in the albums and everything? Do you feel like you're finding your rhythm, that the groove is happening? Where have you evolved? Where do you think this band has evolved, and where do you think it's going to go?
I think the biggest evolution is the production. You know, there was everything when you're starting out, or even when you have a couple albums in, or, you know, a couple tours going on, you get this feeling of you're at your peak. Everything you're doing, once you nail it, it's gold.
Yeah.
And then 5 years later, you go back and listen to it, and you're like, what was I thinking? What is this? Why did I do this? I should have done this. And I think that production and that just knowledge of how sound works and frequencies, and that, you know, taking in other types of music, I think that all has an impact on it. And that's where, in Strings of Atlas, at least, I noticed a huge difference, is that learning how to layer vocals, learning what drum supplementing is versus drum replacement, learning how to widen guitars, really how to hone in that bass and make it where the bass will come out, but not just muddy up a track. All things that you're just always learning. And it is a huge noticeable difference in that. And I think there's always something new to learn. So as far as, you know, the evolution in the future, probably 5 years from now, I'll go back and I'll listen to these and I'll be like, they're good, but this is what I could change in it, you know?
Yeah. How much of the previous catalog do you play live? Do you supplement a lot of the older stuff with what you do now, or do you feel like because you're so much more evolved that it's you know, or have you enhanced those because you're evolved? Have you gone back and played with those and enhanced them a little bit? How do you approach, you know, putting the set list together in that respect? Is it a mixture? Do you like to play a lot of the newer stuff? What is your approach on that?
It's definitely a mix, but with heavier emphasis on the newer stuff. Pretty much from like Ground Zero Texas to now are the more polished versions of things. So those are the ones that I'll lead with, especially In a Better World. Like that album was just amazing. Like, everything went so perfectly in that album, and it was so well received that that's like my starter now, where it used to be So Far From Home. And that one, while still a great album, at least I feel like everything in that it said what I wanted to say, and it said it the right way. There are tracks on it that I feel were emphasized by people. There are ones that people will still ask for. There are ones that people go back and watch the video for, or something like, you know, in that fashion. And even though they may not be necessarily my go-to tracks, I will be sure to play them as people are requesting them like that. Because to me, anybody who's been around long enough and has listened to the stuff that you were not polished in and have stuck around and still want to hear what you do, if that's what they want to hear, like you play it for them. They deserve it. Like anybody, because it's so easy to be like, well, I don't really like this track. I'm not gonna give this band a chance at all.
Yeah,
But people who are with it, and you're like, I'm learning. They know that you've been in it 2 years. They know you've only been in it 5 years, whatever. And you're learning, and you're constantly pushing yourself to do better. They're sticking with you, and I still play it. I think my cutoff is probably the Atomic Girls album, because man, did all the production on that thing myself, and it shows. I mean, I was some of the stuff I did back around, like I was recording music back before Wi-Fi existed. So there's a noticeable sound difference when on some of the recording equipment back then versus now and everything. A lot of this stuff, it just makes you sound like a pro anyway. But it's got a good feel, and it's got like this grit to it that I think no matter how polished you made it, there's this kind of like underlying tone that really sucks people in. So I'll still play those on occasion. They're more fun to do live now because you can do so much more with the sound. People recognize it, but you're making it sound better too. So I don't know. Maybe it'll end up on an album somewhere where it's best of or greatest hits or something. Repolished.
Yeah, you always wonder why they remaster those when they put out the greatest hits, why they remaster those songs, and now you kind of give us a little insight into that.
Exactly. We're like, this is a good track, but we can do it better.
In terms of like setting up how you do music, you have Streets of Atlas, and then you have all the other things you're doing. Is your approach different, or do you feel like it's very similar in all the other projects that you do? And how is it different? Is it different studio wise as opposed to live for you in those atmospheres? I mean, obviously with some of the bands you're not even performing, you're just producing and some of that stuff. So, but do you have a different feel when you're doing that instead of performing?
I think when you're in the studio, you have a lot more leeway to be creative in a sense of you can try things out that maybe long shots. Like you're like, I don't know if this will work, but I'm going to play it just to see. And if it does, then great. And if it doesn't, it's no big deal. And I think you can still be creative live, but you really have to know your craft on it. And you can't just jump into something random and hope it works out, especially if you're trying to make a name for yourself. If you've been playing forever and you have a following of 100,000 people and all that, and you do something goofy, they just kind of laugh and roll with it. Everyone kind of like rolls the punches with you. But if you're starting off, and I think you get any kind of big opportunity, you're like, this is how the song sounds, and I have to keep doing this no matter what. And you kind of lose a little bit of that creativity in the sense of you want it to be perfect, or at least you want it to be memorable. And for the right reasons, not for the ones who completely bombed when you went up there and did something and sang in the wrong key or something like that.
You mentioned that you did American Ninja Warrior. You're a pro wrestler, and I know that you keep a pretty healthy lifestyle. And I'm curious how much of that goes into your music. Do you like? Does that help you in terms of? I know it helps you in terms of longevity and stamina and things like that. But I mean, as musically, do you feel like you wouldn't be able to do this if you were kind of living the rock star lifestyle?
I think to an extent, yeah. And I try to stay as healthy as I can. Honestly, I didn't even drink until I was 25, and then it became like almost like a badge of honor kind of thing where people would be like, "Oh, can I buy you a drink at a show?" Yeah. And it used to be so many times I'd be like, "No, I'm sorry, I don't drink. And people seemed so let down, like so hurt by it. I started being like, okay, sure, buy me a drink. Why not? Buy me a beer, buy me a shot, whatever. And I think that's the one thing that I never had in like lifestyle that now is just like a normal thing.
Yeah.
But I think too, when I was a kid, it was just my mom and I, and we grew up pretty I get poor. I was going to say this. We didn't really have much at all. It was like hamburger helper and like mac and cheese out the box kind of thing. And that was my diet forever. And I thought this was a perfectly normal thing. And it wasn't until I started really getting out there and sort of like in the health food town, like in Austin, everyone's always about health food, vegan, non-gluten, like craziness. And I started to realize just how much more was out there in terms of food. It makes a huge difference when, I've never been like really a morning guy, but my body kind of started to adjust as I got older, and it was like I wake up just naturally 8 o'clock for no reason, and it was like, oh, this is nice, like being out here and like catching most of the daylight instead of just being around night all the time. And it kind of, I don't know, it shifts your well-being and it makes it a lot more, you're more energetic when you're doing stuff, which I think definitely shows in music when you're playing or singing anything. If you have that energy, when you're tired all the time and you're always being like drugged down, it's kind of like you feel it. You're playing a song, but you're just playing it. Like it's not, nothing's coming through it. But when you're feeling the music, when you've got that energy, you've got that vibe, it's like you're somehow transferring that into the music,
Yeah.
And it makes a difference. It really does. I think, especially when you get older, you can do that stuff when you're 20. When you're 35, you can't do that. Like it's not the same. It is not the same.
I'm curious how much show, because it is about showmanship and it's about, the performing, and how much has the wrestling helped you as a performer on stage, and how much has the stage performer helped you as a wrestler?
See, I think it was the stage that got me ready for wrestling, because the first time I went up there and there's 1,500 people and you're like, oh, this is bigger than half the shows I've played. Like as an indie band in bars and everything, bars hold 300 people and that's it,
Yeah.
So when you go up there, it's a little different because you're having to react. It's more physicality. You're ducking clotheslines and taking punches and things like that. And there's more of that.
You tell me there's nobody who's jumped on the stage and tried to give you a clothesline before? You are a rock band, for God's sakes.
Maybe once or twice. It's fine. But that was interesting base. I didn't walk out there and be like, all right, I got 15 minutes. I'm gonna take drop kicks to the chest and but it was kind of cool the way it just carried over. You went out, it was like automatically you were in that show guy mode, like you were ready to talk to people and be entertaining. And I think a lot of people, there's that step of you have to get used to it.
What has been the secret to your longevity? How have you managed to stay with this so long? I mean, it had to have been a super struggle for you for a very long time. And I'm curious what kept you going all this time.
Ah, man, that's a tough question. I think at some point I stopped worrying about what people thought of it. And which is tough.
Yeah.
Because especially when you're in the mentality of you want to play shows, you don't want to play shows to two people.
Yeah.
You want to play shows to an audience. And that's tough when you tell the audience, I don't care what you think about it.
Yeah.
So I think at some point that kind of crossed my mind where it was like, you have to make a decision now of, are you going to do things that you're expected to do, or things that make you happy? And there's only so long, I think, as an artist, you can do things that you're expected to do before you just burn out and you hate the art. They say don't turn it into your day job, which is kind of exactly what I did with this record label. And it is tough. Like all the stuff that you're expected to do in it, there's things you have to do for a business. And, people are like, oh, I'm in a band, it's not a business. I'm like, no, your band is your business. And if it's not, that means it's your hobby, and that's fine. Then if you don't get these gigs or whatever, you never get paid because it's a hobby. But if you're worried about that and you want to go on tour and you want to build this stuff, it's a business. So it's tough to do that. But I think being able to step back and say, I'm going to keep doing the parts that make me happy no matter what, and having the freedom to do that. I mean, it's a crapshoot, people might hate it and never listen to your stuff again. I mean, that's just something you kind of risk for it. Or it turns out you are making good music, you're making a connection with people. And even though it might not be what they want to hear at the moment, you're going to find the right people eventually. Billions of people on the planet, you're not going to get all of them, but you don't need all of them. You need the right people, the people that understand what you're doing. And if you're able to find those people by doing what you love, then it's all good. That's how you keep going. On the days you don't want to make anything, you just sit and kind of pick at the guitar a little bit. All of a sudden you are making something because you still love to do it. It's not something you have to do.